Professor Smith, you are the 10th Goodhart Professor we have the pleasure of interviewing, and we are very grateful to you for agreeing to add to our archive. You've had an illustrious and a varied career in which you've held academic positions at 5 universities and professorships at 3 of those.
Yes.
I hope that we can talk today about your early life and your career, touching on your aspirations for your time in the Goodhart Chair, and then at a later stage there'll be a chance to talk about your scholarly work, and again, hopefully you can talk about your research as the Goodhart incumbent. So could we start with when you were born, just shortly after the war?
Yes.
In 1947.
That's right. 2 years after the war, born in Christchurch in New Zealand in 1947 in January. My father was in the Air Force. He stayed in the Air Force after the war. He'd been a navigator in the Solomons in Guadalcanal during the war, but he decided he would stay in the Air Force. And that meant that our early life, I had an older sister, a younger brother and sister, meant that it was a very disrupted life. We came to England, I think the year after I was born. My father was doing a specialist navigator's course, but the services were such that we moved every 2 or 3 years, so the early schooling was very, very disrupted. I think I went to about 5 different primary schools all over New Zealand.
Yes.
Mm.
So, Professor Smith, your early life was somewhat disrupted because you moved several times.
Yes.
You went to primary school in Christchurch?
No, I started in Wellington.
In Wellington.
And then went to Christchurch.
And then to Christchurch.
And then back to Wellington.
Back to Wellington.
Yes. So.
And you started your high school. You did your high school at St. Bede's.
Yes, but I also had a year in Wellington. Well, we moved to a place called Blenheim in between, after Wellington, after Christchurch, I think we went to Blenheim. And I made the mistake of winning a scholarship to a boarding school in Wellington, and I did not like it one little bit. Fortunately, after a year of that, my father decided he'd had enough of the Air Force, and he changed his job, and we then went to Christchurch.
Right.
At which point I had to go to a new secondary school.
Which was St. Bede's?
That was St. Bede's, yes.
Is that a Catholic school?
Well, they're both all Catholic schools,
yes.
The early ones taught by nuns, the later ones by Morris priests.
Right.
Mm.
And at that early stage, were there any subjects at school that you excelled in?
I was most interested, I suppose, in literature. I was very bad at Latin. I think I was very badly taught at Silverstream. And then when I went to St. Bede's, I had a different teacher and made the subject completely different. I actually enjoyed chemistry, but I didn't enjoy the chemistry teacher at St. Bede's. And he once told me I was a complete waste of time. I was so cross. I worked hard at it, and I got the top mark in chemistry in a national exam. He never spoke to me ever again. And mathematics I quite enjoyed. But again, the teacher, I asked him why we were differentiating functions, because I couldn't quite see the point of it, and he said, never mind, just do it. And that doesn't half put you off the subject, I think.
That's right.
But some of the teachers I had, particularly in English, I had a particularly good English teacher, a man called Father Weir, John Weir, who was a poet who had written quite a bit of his own poetry, but was an expert on the poetry of James K. Baxter. And I lost contact with him for quite a while, but met him again quite recently when he published the complete prose works of James K. Baxter, a 4-volume work. He's now in his 80s. It was a wonderful piece of work, quite an amazing piece of scholarship. So I'm pleased to have kept in touch with him.
How wonderful to have met him again.
Made in touch with him again,
Yes. Must have been very meaningful.
It is, yes. He tells me he's writing a biography of Lewis Carroll, and I told him I thought that field was already rather full, but he was not daunted.
Mrs. Smith, that takes us from your high school at St. Bede's to the University of Canterbury.
University of Canterbury, that's right,
Yes.
1965.
65,
is
thank you.
Was when I went.
I see. And was there a link between St Bede's and the university?
Not particularly.
No.
Well, other than that the man who taught me history at St Bede's was actually giving some lectures at the university in history, and he was a very good history teacher. I only studied it for 2 years, I think, with him. But he took a very different approach from pretty well all the other teachers at the school, and just left us to get on with it, to read and write essays and so forth. He was very good.
You started an LLB.
Yes.
Was that your first degree, or did you have to do a pre?
No. But in your first year, you did only one law subject. The others were arts subjects. The arts subjects I took were political science, history, and English, and then legal system. And you had to get a good mark in legal system to get in, to be allowed to go on in law.
Yes. Any outstanding lecturers or teachers who
Yes.
stand out from that time?
Absolutely. But in politics, I had lectures by a man called Austin Mitchell, who was quite a national personality. He subsequently came back to England and became MP for Hull and Grimsby, the Labour MP for Hull and Grimsby, quite a major figure here too. A man called James Flynn, who was an American refugee really from the Vietnam War, but a very considerable mind. And then J.G.A. Pocock, who's an honorary fellow of St John's, who went off to become a professor at MIT. Quite outstanding group of scholars.
And what actually made you decide to read law in the first instance?
I'd known since I was about 12 that I wanted to study law. I wanted to be a lawyer.
To be a lawyer.
Yes. Mainly the product of reading.
Yes.
Reading about lawyers, mainly the English barristers, Patrick Hastings, people of that sort.
And so you completed your degree and went on to do an LLM. Was that a research course or a taught course?
No, it wasn't immediate actually. Between the LLM and the LLB and the LLM, I'd in fact got married in the last year of my LLB, which was probably not a very wise thing to do in August of the year when the examinations were in November, so I possibly wasn't concentrating as well as I should have. But I then went to the Treasury for a year and taught and worked in the Treasury in Wellington for a year, and decided that sort of practice was not for me. It was extremely dull, and I'd always thought about being an academic, and so I went back to Canterbury as an assistant lecturer and did the LLM while I was doing that. So the LLM was part-time, but it was a 2-year course. I did papers in jurisprudence and criminal law, and then a dissertation in criminal law.
Wow.
On the doctrine of provocation.
At this point, you were resolved to become an academic, so that it was just a natural stepping stone to take an assistant lectureship at the end of your LLM.
While I was doing the LLM.
While you were doing the LLM,
Yes.
you started that.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Well, that was a quite common step.
Yes.
But it was a slightly dangerous step because nobody had ever got a first in the LLM writing a dissertation. Now it's not saying a great deal because the faculty, although law had been taught there for a very long time, its origin was still very much as a place where young men were taught how to become practicing lawyers. So the idea that you might be doing a research type degree was not a common one. So that's what I did.
Right. And you had this position as an assistant lecturer for
Yes.
2 years.
Yes.
And it was at this point perhaps that you began to think about perhaps a bigger stage.
Yes. Yes.
And what made you decide to think about Cambridge?
Yes. Well, the subjects that I taught at Canterbury were, and I lectured first year courses in both criminal law and constitutional law. And the two subjects that have stayed with me throughout my career. and I also took jurisprudence in my master's course, and some of that was the criminal jurisprudence of H.L.A. Hart. We studied that, and so I knew I wanted to go abroad, and I knew I wanted probably to come to England, and I knew that further study would be as good a way of doing that as any. So I looked at both Oxford and Cambridge, and in fact I was accepted for Oxford and Cambridge, obviously, and I had thought of trying to work with Hart, but his work was too philosophically oriented for me. Some of the work that early works that he'd written, and Punishment and Responsibility in particular, wonderful book. In fact, I met Hart when he came to New Zealand and showed him around Christchurch, and we discussed Glanville Williams, and it is fair to say that in one of his essays he shows, I think fairly convincingly, that some of the thinking about liability for negligence was not properly thought through, which he attributed to Glanville, which I don't think was quite fair, but certainly J.W.C. Turner in Cambridge at the time really had a view of the impermissibility of punishing negligence, which didn't hold water. But so my choice was between those two, and then the possibility of Sir John Smith, or John Smith, later Sir John Smith at Nottingham. And I came to know John really quite well, but I preferred obviously Cambridge to Nottingham just as a place to study.
Yes. And I also wondered why Gombe and Keys as a college.
Fairly simple reason. I got a scholarship there. But it wasn't quite as straightforward as that. I'd got a scholarship, I got a Commonwealth scholarship, which took me to, well, it could have taken me to Nottingham or Oxford, but I decided to come here with that. And then subsequently I got the TAP scholarship, which was a Keys scholarship. And there is a strong New Zealand link, as you probably know,
yes,
between Keys and New Zealand. Robin Cook, who became Lord Cook, had been a fellow there,
right,
and so I was aware of that
yes,
that link. And so that was the real.
was the reason.
Yes.
I mean, when you first arrived, that was 1973.
72.
72.
Because I came as a student.
Oh, right. Was it a huge change for you
Yes.
from New Zealand?
Yes, very significant change, and a change much for the better. Although I struggled with the place at first, I have to say,
Just
the sheer intensity of it. But the law fellows then were Michael Pritchard and Len Seeley, and there was in fact a third fellow, Jim Farmer, who was also a New Zealander, and Len Seeley, of course, is a New Zealander. And it helped, I think, that Michael was familiar with New Zealanders and their ways, but I went from being a teacher to a full-time student again, and I found that really quite difficult. I found it difficult not having my own place to work, because in those days, of course, there was nowhere in the faculty particularly for you to work. If you worked, you worked in the old Squire Law Library, now the Keys Library, and it wasn't a very congenial place. There were people to talk to. Paul Finn, my predecessor, in the Goodhart chair, of course.
Yes.
He was a year ahead of me, but I became very friendly with him.
Yes.
Jim Evans, another New Zealander, was a year ahead of him. So there was a bit of a community,
Yes.
but it was actually quite an isolated position to be in.
And I just did contrast in general terms with New Zealand, which was probably better run in many senses, but to come here with this huge sort of population density for a start,
Yes,
must have taken a bit of getting used to.
a bit of getting used to. I think
Yes.
that's right. Yes.
Because you were here you stayed at Keys from 1973 to 1981.
Yes,
A fair time. You became a fellow.
I did. There's a story, the third person I mentioned, Jim Farmer, who was, as I say, also a New Zealander, decided that he was an assistant lecturer, but he decided that he was going to go back to New Zealand and practice law, which he's done and is still practicing law in New Zealand. He, for a while, had chambers between Sydney and Auckland. He's an extremely high-profile barrister. But anyway, he decided to do that, and it meant there was a vacancy in the college. And I saw it advertised in the Times. Nobody told me about it. I thought, oh, I'll apply for that. So I did, and got it, to my great surprise.
And shortly after that, you became a tutor. That was
Yes.
in 1974. And you
Yes.
retained that until 1981.
Yes.
What courses were you tutoring?
No, I was a tutor in the sense of
Supplying.
the Cambridge tutor, so that I had, my pupils were people not lawyers.
Right.
You know, they were tutorial pupils, some of whom went on to great notoriety, including people like Alistair Campbell.
Interesting.
And so one would watch one's pupils go off and do various things. But no, I was, as a supervisor and a college lecturer, I was supervising criminal law and constitutional law.
Did you have administrative duties?
As a tutor,
As
you
a
do.
tutor,
Yes, you
yes.
do quite significant
Yes.
ones. Yes, having to see the students beginning and end of each term and dealing with things when they went wrong, really.
Yes.
And I think occasionally, no, I never did stand in as at that stage as acting director of studies. Michael Pritchard was the director of studies pretty well the whole time. And if he was away, Len Seeley would have done it. Although Len was the senior tutor for much of that period.
He's spoken of that, and what a considerable responsibility and time commitment.
It was a major commitment for him, because he was both, in those days, senior tutor and admissions tutor, and you know, it was just himself and a secretary really running the whole place. And the master at that stage was a man called Joseph Needham, FRS, FBA, a very unusual combination, who was a man who just thought about his subject the whole time, and that meant there was a considerable vacuum underneath him to be filled by others running the college, really.
Yes. Gosh. Do any other notable scholars spring to mind? I know that I'm thinking, for example, of Crick. I know that he'd left, but
yes, he
perhaps
had.
you had.
I met him once. I met him. Yes. Yes. In fact, I didn't know who he was when I first met him, and I was in the company of Jim Farmer, and we found ourselves talking to him at dinner one night, and the person presiding was the Quick Professor of Insect Physiology, Sir Vincent Wigglesworth.
Really?
Yes. And Crick was very pleased that he thought he'd discovered the origin of life or something, life or the universe, one of the two. And Wigglesworth was teasing him, particularly at dessert, about aspects of this. And he was a man full of fun, actually. And you know, for Crick, I'm talking about both of them really. Although Wigglesworth was a much quieter gent. He was probably about 80 at that stage. But I met him Wigglesworth on the stairs the next day, and I said, I enjoyed your conversation with Crick. And he said, yes, he didn't know what I was talking about, did he? And then the major figures in the university, of course, for me were Glanville, and he really was a great mentor. The other person, I would say, I had a huge admiration for was David Williams, DGT Williams, who was again a very well, I went to some of his lectures and I thought they were the best lectures I ever saw. I really did think that he had an ability, because he had a background as an historian, to put public law into a political, social, economic, historical context, in addition to the law,
Yes.
in a way that I've never seen anybody else really been able to do. So,
And he would probably have been at, well, I know that he was at Wolfson, he was the president at Wolfson.
he was the senior tutor of Emmanuel at that time. Yeah.
Yes.
And he was a reader-in-law, I think, when I first met him.
Yes.
But he was very supportive, very nice man.
And any other scholars that you recall, perhaps Sir William Wade, do you perhaps recall him?
Well, yes, he was Master of Keys. He became Master of Keys. Slightly forbidding individual in public, but actually a very pleasant man. Now I was involved in his election to the mastership. I'm afraid David Williams wasn't very happy because Sir William came and took the Rouse Bowl chair in English law, which I think David had rather supposed he might possibly get, and almost nobody else would have beaten David for it apart from Sir William Wade, and David did in fact succeed.
Yes.
Sir William Wade in due course. But no, he was a very good master. Michael Len Seeley.
Both have been interviewed for the archive.
Right.
And obviously would have been quite well known to you.
Very good colleagues.
Yes.
Very, very good colleagues.
Yes.
Yes.
Professor Smith, you became a barrister and a solicitor of the High Court in 1979.
Yes.
Does it mean that you had to go back? You went back to New Zealand?
No, I happened to be back in New Zealand. I qualified for that in 1972. I just never got called, that's all.
Right.
So I was actually eventually called in 1979, so there was nothing very magical about that. It wasn't as though I was doing any work. It was just that I thought I might as well get called since I was eligible to be that.
Yes.
And I had probably got an idea of possibly moving into practice in this country. I can't remember now, to be perfectly honest, but that might have been what was in my mind, because I did join an Inn of Court in the Middle Temple. There are a couple of other people I perhaps ought to mention. John Smith I've mentioned earlier, who was also a holder of the Arthur Goodhart.
From Nottingham?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, but he was a Cambridge man, of course, a Downing man. And he became a real mentor. And it was mainly through what used to be called the Society of Public Teachers of Law. We had an annual conference, and John always came. And at that stage, it was the work that was done in the subject groups. Glanville, incidentally, was the one responsible for dividing the annual meetings up into subject groups so that people could talk about their own subjects and write papers and present papers and so forth. But John was always there every year, and he was at that stage writing commentaries for the Criminal Law Review, something he did for 40 odd years, I think. I mean, it was an astonishing contribution, and he was always very happy to talk with you, particularly in the bar afterwards, over a half, as he always had just a half.
Yeah.
And he was quite happy to be challenged on the way in which he'd interpreted a recent case and all that kind of thing. And he would read one's material and comment on it. Yep. And the other person was Andrew Ashworth, who in 1976 was the editor of the Criminal Law Review, and he was a wonderful editor, very good at reading your stuff very carefully and critically, suggesting how you might rephrase or think about a point again, and very happy, particularly with a younger scholar, to help people produce a good piece of work. I mean, he was a contemporary of mine, more or less.
Right.
But he's just retired from the primary chair at Oxford, the name of which escapes me at the moment. I'll come back to it. It's the oldest chair of English law. But he, I think I said earlier that I did my master's thesis on the doctrine of provocation, and Landward had said I ought to publish it, and I was one of these days going to get round to publishing it. And then in 1975, Ashworth wrote an article in the Cambridge Law Journal. I thought, no, I'm not going to publish mine in the light of that. It was a quite astonishing piece of work. And so when I first met him, I think in 1977 at one of these SPTL conferences, we got on extremely well because it was quite clear that he knew a vast amount about provocation.
Yes.
Yeah, so he became a very good friend. Still is. Mm.
Well, you were in this position at Keys for until 1981, when you were given a readership at Durham.
Mm.
And I worked out, I think you were only about, not very, 34 years old, I think.
Probably about
something
that,
like
yes.
that. Was quite young.
Yes.
And I wondered what the circumstances of this appointment were.
Well, the person who initiated it was John Smith. John Smith wrote to me and said, I wonder whether you might be interested in taking this position. You know, it's a way forward for you. It's a good little university. John himself came from Barnard Castle, which is up in that area of the country, but he was obviously sitting on the committee that was appointing to the readership, and for various domestic reasons too, which I won't go into. It was quite a good time to think of moving away for a while. It's not that far away from Cambridge. It's only about 3 hours on the train, so that's what I did for a while, yes.
And in many ways it was a similar sort of lovely medieval structure.
Yes, yes.
And lovely scenery as well.
Beautiful.
Yes.
Yes.
Perhaps that reminded you a bit of New Zealand, maybe.
Up to a point, it had been lived in for rather longer. I mean, the cathedral is absolutely wonderful.
Yes.
I used to have lunch there quite regularly. They had in the Undercroft, they had an extremely good little good food guide restaurant, which was really quite cheap, but it was very small, and had been kept small by the then Dean, Frank Dowrick. And that was quite a controversial stance for him to take. He liked the idea that he knew all the students, he knew them all by name and so forth, but it did mean that the possibilities for people to get promotion because the place was getting bigger were limited.
You mentioned the dean. You became the dean there in 1984.
Yes, but it was a fairly nominal position. The place was in practice run by the head of school, but Frank Dowrick was the dean.
Right. So it wasn't too onerous.
No,
no,
not really at all.
No.
And I taught criminal law there mainly, criminal law and public law again. Yeah. And I taught that with a man called Bob Sullivan, G.R. Sullivan. And we had very similar extracurricular interests, rugby, cooking and opera. and I got on very well with him. I think he was slightly worried when I first arrived, and he was a lecturer, I think, and I think he was worried that I might try to edge him out of the criminal law class, but certainly not. So we did it conjointly, very happily for several years. And he then wrote a book with Andrew Simister, whose name you might know. Andrew has been a Fellow of Keys, another New Zealand Fellow of Keys, and who's a research fellow. And they've written Simister and Sullivan on criminal law, which is now written also by Virgo and John Spencer. He was a very, very good colleague. I enjoyed him a great deal, still do.
I actually have a photograph given to me by Len Seeley of yourself and Professor Mr.
And Robin Cook, I think.
Perhaps, that's right.
Almost
yes.
certain.
Yes.
Maybe I've got one with Jim Farmer in it, but not Sinister.
Yes.
But Jim Farmer and Len Seeley, Robin Cook, and myself in Christchurch, which I can dig up if it's any use.
Oh, I would love to have a
Right.
copy of that. Thank you.
Yes.
You were awarded a PhD during this period.
Yeah.
Was it a Durham degree?
No, it's a Cambridge degree by special regulations. In
Right.
other words, by my publications.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I wondered about that.
Well, the story behind that is that Glanville, after I'd been working on the PhD, we settled on the law of contempt. So it took me a while. I knew I wanted to do a PhD, but I wasn't quite sure what I was going to write a PhD on. But I had always been interested in contempt of court, and Glanville said, "Oh no, I think that's a very good topic. So why don't you do that?" So I started working on that, and after about 6 months or so, I discovered that another quite senior academic in England was writing a book on it, and there was the possibility of reform of the law in the air, and so it was a man called Gordon Borry who became Lord Borry, and he did in fact publish a book with a chap called Nigel Lowe, and so Borry and Lowe was the first book on contempt of court. So what Glanville then said is, well, I'm not sure that PhDs are worth having anyway. The usual sort of iconoclasm that you might expect from Glanville. Would you like to write a book with me instead? And so I began working on his book on property offences. And he had been commissioned by Sweet Maxwell to write a 4-volume account of English criminal law. So he did criminal law, the general part, in 1961. Then he was supposed to be following up with either the offences against the person, or the offences against the state, or the offences against property. And in 1968, the Theft Act had been passed, and although Sir John Smith had written a book on it, it was only on the Theft Act. And so I began working on the book on property offences with Glanville.
And that was published
1984, I think.
yes. And I hope that we can talk about that, talk about your
Later.
book in a second.
Yes, surely.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
And of course, I eventually picked up the interest in contempt, which we can come back to later too. And I finished up writing an edition of a book written by Arledge and Eadie. And Arledge had in fact been a student of Glanville's and had been encouraged by Glanville to write a book on contempt. So he had actually scribbled quite a bit of the book, and then he got it out. He was busy practicing barrister. He got it out, and he and David Eadie put together a book on really the Contempt of Court Act. And it was not terribly well reviewed or received. There was a particular review by a man called Graham Zellick, who had been a student at Keys, became Vice Chancellor of the University of London, and Professor at Queen Mary and Dean at Queen Mary and so forth. And he was very critical because it didn't have any academic input.
Right.
So I was the academic input for the new edition,
Right.
which was done, I think, in you've got the budget.
80.
Well, it's got 1998, the 4th edition,
Right.
but we did a much earlier edition, I think. The 4th edition was 2011.
Thank you.
So we've done a 2nd, 3rd and 4th edition.
Right. Thank you. Professor Smith, in 1986, you were given a chair at the University of Reading. Again, this was quite early in your career. You were still in your 30s.
In my 30s, that's
Yes.
right.
And so, presumably, you moved to Reading to take this opportunity.
I did.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think John Smith was in the background again.
And what were your specialities at Reading? Still criminal law?
And constitutional law.
Constitutional
Yes.
law. And you brought out a book during this time. Which
Public
was
Order.
That's right.
That's right.
In 1987.
Yes,
Yes. And you became head of department
I did. Yes.
in 88. Any recollections of this period in your life?
Yes, actually, if we just go back one step, while I was in Durham, I was interested in computing in the law. And one of the reasons I was interested is that Glanville was using a word processor. And to keep up with them, I had to buy a word processor. And while we were still trying to work on the book together, it was one of those things that you had floppy disks that big, 6-inch floppy disks, 13 to a chapter sort of thing. But it seemed to me that although I couldn't see it very clearly, that this was clearly going to get better. And so while I was at Durham, an organisation, a governmental organisation called the Computer Board, invited scholars to bid for grants on the use of computing in their subjects. And so I applied for one and got £150,000 from them to start working on that. And that eventually developed into, after I left, it developed into a special centre. And there were 2 centres in the country, one in Durham and one in Warwick, and further monies was pumped into it subsequently. And by the time I got to Reading, things had changed quite significantly by that stage. And there were 1 or 2 people in Reading who were interested in computing. But again, I managed to persuade the university at that stage that we all ought to have computers, and I was using them for administrative purposes, sorting out timetables and all that kind of thing. And so that was one of the things that I managed to get done while I was there, to get the whole faculty computerised.
Yes.
And that was fairly early.
It was actually.
Yes.
Yes.
Helped by a nice man called John Murdoch in particular, who made a bit of a thing of this.
Yes. Interesting.
And I also, it was while I was in Reading, I had a very good friend in the sociology department, a man called Tank Wallington, P.A.J. Wallington, who was about 6'6" and was an ex-policeman. And he was doing quite a lot of work on the implementation of the Public Order Act, 1986. He was able to get access to quite a lot of what was actually going on in the Metropolitan Police, how they're actually policing the Act. And so when I was writing my book, I had quite a lot of contact with him.
Yes.
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 And Sir Peter Imbert was a good colleague and friend of his, and so I got to know him quite well. He was the man who managed the Balcombe Street siege. I don't know whether you remember that. One of those rather nasty kidnapping sieges in London. But he was very sympathetic to the academic enterprise, and so he let Wellington, arranged it that Wellington could go and take part in the organisation of policing of demonstrations and so forth. And so he was writing about that aspect of it, and I was writing about the legal stuff. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Sounds like a very fruitful time.
It was.
Yes.
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 Yeah. I think it was at that stage too that I did join the Little Temple.
That's right, 1992.
No, I had. Because I came back here in 1990. I think I came back to Cambridge in.
Came back to Cambridge in 1996,
Oh no.
according to your school. 1996.
Yeah. No, I'm pretty sure that's 1990.
Right. I wondered about
That's when I got the chair, I think, in 1996.
96, yes.
Yeah.
I wondered about that because
Yes.
there seemed to me a gap of 6 years.
Yes.
And
No, I actually came back here to a
yes.
lectureship.
Right. That explains it.
Yes.
I was going to ask you if you could just fill us in. Because
Yes.
Yes.
No, I came
So
back, and I think.
You left
So-
the chair to take up a lectureship.
Yes.
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 You wanted to come back to Cambridge.
Yes.
Yes.
As Glanville had done.
Yes.
Glanville left the chair in London.
Right.
Queen Professor of Jurisprudence, I think he was. But he lived in Cambridge the whole time.
Yes.
And he came back to a lectureship and a fellowship at Jesus. And I did the same thing.
And when you returned, I noticed there were several book publications during this period between 1990 and your, well, the time that you returned
Yes.
to Cambridge.
That'd be right.
You produced your property offences and your harm and culpability, which you joint edited.
Yes.
Um,
And I wonder whether by that stage we hadn't done a new edition of the Contempt book. I can't honestly remember.
can you look that up?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Because I think I might have been made a bencher of the Middle Temple in 1992. That might be it.
Your Who's Who entry has it as Bar and Middle Temple.
Does it have bencher? Does it
Um,
say when I was made a
call
bencher?
to the bar. Just see my note here. This Bar and Middle Temple. We can always just, what we'll do at the beginning of the second interview is tidy up any uncertainty.
Okay.
That's a good way of just going back and reflecting.
Yes. Okay.
Professor Smith, you said you came back to Cambridge and you lectured, presumably your specialities were criminal law and public law.
Yes, and
Yes.
civil liberties at the LLM level,
Yes.
and I also did media law.
Right.
I did a half paper in media law
Right.
for the faculty.
Right. So,
Yes.
in fact, that's an extra 6 years that you were in Cambridge for, making your ultimate departure. Perhaps even more of a wrench, but we'll come back to that later.
Well, I think I was here for 16 years.
Altogether.
1990 to 2007.
2007. That's right.
Mm.
You were awarded a chair in criminal and public laws
Yes.
in 1996.
Yes, that'd be right.
Yes.
Yes.
You were still at Keys.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, as it happened, somebody had left Keys at the same time, so Keys was looking for a fellow in law again.
Right.
So it worked out very well.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes. And you became chairman of the faculty in 99, and you had this position until 2001.
Yes.
And I wondered whether there were any innovations that you had brought in during this period.
Yes.
Or
I think there were quite a few. And I think probably the most important one was the Freshfields money. And because when I came back, the chairman of the faculty was John Baker, and I found him an extremely easy man to work with and get on with, and he was very receptive to new ideas. As long as you did say, well, in Reading we did this. But what I found was that a number of the people in the faculty didn't have access to computing, particularly people from the poorer colleges. The people from the wealthier colleges were provided with this by the colleges, but people at the others were not. And I took the line that this was something the faculty ought to be doing something about, and so we did set up a system, I think using York Fund money, whereby people from the colleges who weren't being supplied could actually get computerized. So it was a mirror of what I was doing in Reading. Same sort of thing.
I didn't realise that.
And then it was pretty clear that we were not going to get any government money to help us equip the university. And I remember being on various university committees trying to persuade them that, you know, the law faculty, that you know, computing was something in the future, and the law too. Could we have some money for it, please? And the answer was no, we couldn't. So at that stage, we went to the city and we dealt with a very pleasant lawyer called Hugh Crisp at Freshfields. And he was an incredibly decent person to work with. And they gave us a significant amount of money, as you know,
Yes.
for the equipment and then for Daniel, in effect.
That's right.
Yep. So that was one.
Very interesting. Yes.
I think that goes back to my interest as a plan in Durham, and so it's
Followed through.
a theme, yes.
Yes.
The other thing that we did was set up the Herbert Smith, and that was talking to Jonathan Scott at Herbert Smith, and I'm pleased to see that that is still running. In fact, I was a beneficiary of it when I had 6 weeks or so here, while I was still the dean at Wellington.
Right.
And met Jonathan in the course of that. The negotiations were tough, but I think, you know, we thought, and my adjutant in all of this, I think, was Jack Beatson. I think he certainly was. And the other thing I want to mention, where we talked about a whole variety of things. I think at one stage we tried to persuade them to buy property for us so that we could actually invite somebody and, you know, accommodate them and so forth. But I think they thought that was a step too far. But they have been extremely loyal to us subsequently, giving us this funding every year, and that meant we could invite people who we wanted to be here, and you know. So there was that, and then the other thing was the endowment of the D.G.T. Williams lecture. Now that had been going for a while when I took over, but there was the prospect of it being endowed by a man called John Nolan, who was a good friend of David Williams, an American. An American lawyer in Washington. And at a certain point, we had to gather up our courage and get in touch with John and say, would he be prepared to do it? And he wrote back saying, yes, how much did we want? I didn't have an idea. So I asked Jack if he would work it out, and Jack worked out a figure, and we wrote to Nolan, and he said, by return, here it is.
Interesting.
Yep.
Yeah.
And although it's tended to be focused on public law, which I don't mind, in fact I think Nolan thought that it would be a general lecture, but as I say, it's mainly been public law since, but that wasn't necessarily
a condition. Right.
No. So those were three
Very interesting.
I think three institutional highlights, if you like, and there were other events, I think. Very memorable event when Lord Bingham came to open a conference on law reporting.
I remember that.
Do you?
Yes.
You remember at the beginning that I made a silly joke about where the exits were, and if anything went wrong, these were the exits, and I did sort of gestures like an airline steward. 5 minutes into the lecture, the alarm bells went, and we all had to go outside. So there was that. There was the opening of the history room by the Lord Chancellor, Terry Irvine.
That's right. It was a wonderful occasion.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. The resolution of the difficulties with the building, that was really just after I'd taken over, and it was in the process of happening. The decisions had been taken.
Yes.
But
still, you would still have been around during the translocation, which was very divisive.
yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you feel, Professor Smith, that the new facility is conducive to, glass and steel and so on, conducive to thinking, academic work?
I think so. Yes, I think so.
Were you in favour of it?
I wasn't here when when the decision to move over here was taken. Now, I was just talking about the difficulty that we had with the noise when the building first opened.
Yes.
And when the glass screen was put right through the middle.
Was that during your time as chairman?
Yes.
Yes.
The implementation of it was.
That's right.
Yes.
Yes.
And we saw a great deal of the architects at that stage, and we came, particularly with the help of Kirsty Allen, who had the major job of refereeing that whole business.
Yes. A very successful outcome in terms of the screen.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
The other thing we did during my time was put that little cafe down in the basement. That had been just unused, and I can't remember whether it was my suggestion, but I think it was. I think I got into a certain amount of trouble about it, actually.
I remember there was some criticism.
That's right.
And yet now it's inconceivable that there isn't some form of refreshment.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So those are highlights. I know that I ought to be thinking more of academic highlights, but
well, this is what I would hope you. I didn't know of these achievements, and for the record, as a faculty history as well as your own history, this is.
Well, these are when I think they happened while I was chair, and I'm not claiming credit for them by any means, but I think it was sort of plotting with a lot of helpful colleagues, and I mentioned Jack Beatson, but there were others, John Spencer, Bill Cornish, various people.
Yes.
Really.
Yes. A very active, dynamic period, actually, in the history of the faculty.
I think it was. Well, I think it was consolidating using the use of the building, really.
Yes.
I mean, we've not had anything like that before.
No.
And something that was ours.
Yes.
I tried quite hard to get pictures into the basement on the walls, and spoke with one of the curators of the National Gallery. I think she came down and had a look at it, and we talked quite a while about the possibility of getting possibly the products of art students' work and putting that sort of thing on our walls on a rotating basis, because I wasn't very keen on having pictures of, dare I say it, deceased white men all over the place.
Yes.
I wanted other things. But the practicalities of it were too great. All kinds of problems about insurance and what happens if they're damaged and all of that kind of thing. So in the finish, it came to nothing. But I'm sorry about that.
Yes. I didn't know about that. That's very interesting. You were at Cambridge for 16 years, during which time, in 1999, you were awarded an LLD. This was by the faculty.
Yes.
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 Any particular comments about that?
No, I mean, again, it's for published works.
Published work.
For the
Yes.
for the various books that I've written.
Yes.
Yep.
You became an honorary bencher in 2001.
Right. Yes, that'd be right.
Yeah.
I wish I'd actually taken a more active interest in the Middle Temple earlier, because I've greatly enjoyed my association with it, I have to say. And both John Smith and Glanville Williams were benchers of the Middle Temple, which is why I chose it. But it's a great opportunity for people to mingle with practitioners, both barristers and the judiciary and so forth.
Yes.
Yes, greatly enjoyed it.
Professor Smith, you moved in 2007 after many, many years. Yeah, we've been close to over 40 years. That must have been quite a wrench for you to leave Cambridge.
Yes.
And I wondered what you took up a chair and deanship at Victoria University.
Yes.
And I wondered why you decided to return to New Zealand.
Yes. Well, it's mainly family reasons. My son, I've only got one son, who is married to a woman, Nicole Moram, who was a fellow of Keys. He was a student at Sydney. He was a barrister in London, and it was clear they were going to get married, and then they decided they were going to go back to New Zealand, start a family, and so forth. His mother died some time ago, so he was more or less on his own. And the university got in touch with me and said this was a job, would I be interested in it? Then they had headhunters. And at first the idea didn't appeal too much because it would have been such a wrench. But on the other hand, the idea of actually being around when they were trying to start a family and so forth was something that did appeal.
Yes.
And Victoria was known to be a difficult faculty, so it was quite an interesting challenge. And I thought, well, I've done this job now at 2 or 3 places, and it's something that I've had quite a bit of experience at, and it would be interesting, and an interesting challenge really. And so it proved.
And obviously you continued with your research.
Yes.
Same specialised areas.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. That was one of the conditions that I put down before I agreed to take the position up. And in fact, I also wanted to try and teach while I was doing it, but that proved impossible. It was not so much the deanship as the provost chancellorship.
That's a relatively recent appointment.
No, I took that up at the same time.
Same time.
Yes.
I see.
And I was in charge of the law faculty and the School of Government.
Right.
And that meant I was part of the senior management of the university, and
Yes.
we met every week, one morning a week. But it meant, being responsible for promotions, for budgeting, for the university, for the strategic direction of the university.
Yes. So it's a considerable project.
Yes,
Yes.
it was. I got on very well with the Vice Chancellor, who had been at St Bede's as it happens.
Really?
Yes. He also had a great interest in cricket, but he was also a very supportive figure. And it was very hard work. One of the big challenges for us was the research assessment exercise, and we concentrated on that in a quite significant way. And I think in 2012 the results came out, and we were scored as the most research active university in the country, and the faculty was the top faculty in the country. So that was an interesting.
Rewarding.
Yes.
Yes. Actually.
And some really tough decisions had to be taken about the way in which the place even was working. It wasn't a very happy place when I first got there. Some of that, well, I won't expand on that, but there were ways in which it could be made happier without doing terribly much.
It sounds, with hindsight, that it was a very worthwhile move, Professor Smith.
Oh yes, I think so. Yes, no, I don't regret it in the slightest. And
Yes.
I was able to come back here for a short time.
Yes.
Every year.
Still retain very strong links.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's right.
Which brings us to your present
Yes.
tenure as the Goodhart Professor. And I wonder if you have any special projects in mind for your time as Goodhart Professor?
Well, I've got all sorts of things that I've got to write. Publishers want me to write new editions of books, which is something I'm trying to avoid if possible, because I want to do some more innovative stuff. But I've got some minor tweakings. One thing I'd like to do is make Arthur Goodhart himself a rather more better known figure than he seems to be. A lot of people don't seem to be aware of who he was or what he was. But he was a very significant figure in a whole variety of ways. There's a significant amount of his papers in the Bodleian, yes. There's quite an archive of his papers. A very interesting man, and as you probably know, he was the editor of the Law Quarterly Review for 50 years.
Yes.
He was H.L.A. Hart's predecessor at University of Oxford as the Professor of Jurisprudence, Master of University College, Oxford. I think he had the great good fortune to inherit money, of course.
Yes.
The L stands for Lehman, the Lehman Brothers, the very wealthy firm, until the big crash, of course. But he was very good at fostering relations, I think, between the judiciary and academics, and he was an American, of course. One of the things I'd like to do too is disinter the reasons why it is the chair in legal science. I've tracked down the organisation in New York which administers the funds which underlie it, and I hope to see if they've got papers on the establishment of the chair. So that's one thing I'd quite like to do. And the other thing that I'd like to help with anyway is get some sense of continuity. Because at the moment each one has to come in almost cold, as it were. I don't, because I know Cambridge reasonably well. So I spoke to Dysenhouse and went to see the house and so forth. And my successors, of course, are John Laws and the Dean of Yale, Harold Coe.
That's right.
So I'm quite keen on talking to John Laws in advance about what's involved, and so there are no surprises, and what the opportunities and possibilities of it are, when they're considerable.
Yes.
Yes.
Because I think it can be quite a surprise to scholars who aren't acquainted with the college system.
Yes.
Everything doesn't happen in the faculty.
Yes, that's right.
I think it can be
Yes.
quite disappointing if that's not accommodated.
Yes. Well, I don't think John will be caught unawares by that, because he was at Oxford, but he read Greek. That keeps coming up in his judgments and his articles. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So that's a sort of longer term project,
Yes,
just to foster some sort of, and possibly even write a sort of handbook for the incumbents or the coming in incomers.
Yes. Professor Smith, before we end, presumably you have been teaching as well.
Yes, I have, yes.
And has that been enjoyable?
Very.
You've been teaching public law, I know.
No, well, oh yes,
No.
yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah. That involves, as you know, supervising dissertations, and we start the business of the presentation this term. They've been preparing for that, so there's that. But I've also been going a course with David Feldman on legislation, and to the best of my knowledge, there's not a course on that in the country, more or less, and certainly there hasn't been here.
No, it's somewhat surprising that there's no course on interpretation of statutes, as far as I know.
No, but
not that that's different, obviously, but
well, interpretation is only one small part of it. What we've tried to do is look at legislation as a phenomenon. I mean, we spend a great deal of time looking at the common law and how it works and so forth, but not anything like as much on the other great source of law, which is legislation. In fact, it's by far the bigger, greater source of law. And it's been fun teaching it with David Feldman, who's had significant experience of the legislative process. He was the legal advisor to the Joint Parliamentary Committee on the implementation of the Human Rights Act. So he has got something of an insider's view of how the legislature actually works. And he had written a book relatively recently on aspects of the legislative process, and it was when I was at a conference here in September, I think, a year or so ago, that I spoke to him and said, look, I'm coming to the Goodhart. I don't suppose you'd be interested in trying to work that up into a course, would you? And he agreed to do that. So that's what we've done. So that's a project in itself. And whether that gives rise to writing subsequently, I'm not sure. I've broached that with him to see whether he might be interested. And he didn't say no.
Perhaps when we speak again in the summer, you might be able to fill us in on these fascinating ideas. And I thank you very much indeed for this account, which is extremely interesting. I'm very grateful to you, Professor Smith.
Thank you very much.
I know that it will be very well received because you have a special place at Cambridge.
Thank you.
And looking forward to resuming our conversation.
Right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. I think I might go off and do some work now going to the film Bridge of Spies, which is a film about, I don't know whether
Yeah, well, I have been on that bridge actually recently.
Not size, spies.
Spies. Oh, I'm thinking of that bridge out just near Potsdam.
Oh yes.
Yes.
Right.
It's not that bridge.
No.
Sorry.
It's a new film, and it's got Mark Rylance
Right.
in it.
Wonderful.
Who is playing the part of somebody who's prosecuted for spying, Abel, who was prosecuted for spying in America.
Of course, that's
And
right.
he was defended by somebody who, one of the things that I do in learning the law is a small section on films that lawyers might like to go and see.
I remember that.
Yes.
Yes, a lovely addition to the book.
Yes, I've got to actually see the films before I can recommend them. Yes.
That's right.
I've met Mark Rylance. He's a bencher of the Middle Temple.
Really?
Yes, and he comes quite a bit. And I say co-author, although he didn't actually do any writing, but Tony Arledge, I was talking about earlier, who Glanville tried to persuade to do the Temple, or did persuade. He was Master Treasurer for a year, and Arledge was a very keen actor, only very keen on theatre, and he persuaded the Middle Temple that they should put on Twelfth Night in the Middle Temple on the 400th year of its first performance, which was in the Middle Temple.
How delightful.
And so they put it on with Mark Rylance and doing the productions and so forth. So that was wonderful.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.